Anyway, I'm going to present more a working method that has evolved. It's more a very sort of personal process, but based on several observations that are local, the place I work, which is India. Can we start? Can I start the slides? Just. Are we good with, yeah? Yeah, great. So just to put the entire idea in a framework, sorry. We're a country of 1,200,000,000 people, just to give you just the sheer numbers. And if you imagine that more than 50%, and I'm using this very conservatively, more than 50% of the built landscape, the built square feet of the country, is built outside the framework of what you and I do. That's outside the framework of the idea of formal architecture, or the position that we take. And we've had a great tradition, over several hundred years. So there's a sort of sophistication that has evolved. And you see that in very different conditions, be it in Jodhpur, which is in northern India. That's in Mumbai, a slum settlement in Mumbai. This is in the forest. And then that's the juxtaposition of the two conditions of the formal and the informal that can coexist. And my interest really is more in this place where they overlap, the place where they can both come together as opposed to where they move apart. Again, what's important in this is that there's a space for gesture. There's a space where there's a possibility of a gesture. How does this work? Yeah. What happened? It always happens to me. I think I'm the one, that's a jinx. Anyway, so what I was going to show was a short video of basically this combination of man, machine, and nature, but how important it is really for man to participate in this fine balance, in maintaining a sort of equilibrium. Is it possible to play the slides, or you can bypass that video, just get on to the next slide. Anyway, so while this is, they're trying to work it out, I think for me the idea of exchange it's far more complex than just, handing over, passing over. It's more complex because there could be an exchange of time, position, a reversal of time, or the origin in which one came first, a place in exchange where authorship and ownership can be reversed. And that's what I'm going to try and demonstrate. Just very quickly, I work, or the practice is more like a medieval atelier. We're set up. There's a huge resource of very highly skilled craftsmen. But again, it's not such a simple sort of relationship where, the architect, I sort of give instructions and then they carry out the instructions, where it's far more intricate, far more complex in its relationship of, how do projects evolve from a process of a dialogue, which could involve storytelling. Just to go back to this slide, it's not that clear, but anyway, I'll try and explain. This is, a very traditional dress on the left side. He wears a sort of cotton cloth, which is called a dhoti, and normally the shirt has a sort of pocket there, and I like this slide very much in this idea of the pocket man. So I was buying these pitchforks, which are this very perfect abstraction of the gesture of the hand. So that was the interest. I'd stopped by and I was handing over the money, and while I was talking to him, I said, how come you're the only one here dressed in this yellow t-shirt? And he says, well, I get it for free, so why not? So I asked him, who gives it to you for free? And he says, well, we have, plywood companies that want to advertise, and, glue companies and so on and so forth. So it made sense. The material itself works in the region, it works and performs well in the region. And then when I was handing him the money, he basically, put his hand into the t-shirt. And what for me is interesting is the way he subverts this idea of commercialization without really making a judgment to it, whether it's right, wrong, good, bad. It's just this sort of very passive, not even passive, I would say, very empathetic view of his own condition and how he can facilitate in this ever-changing time, which and India is going through this very rapid economic development. So you have this sort of juggernaut that's pushing its way through, but the way they're able to create a space or create some space and time for them to be able to participate without losing their position or without losing the gestures that they need to make. So that's, I don't know why this, can you press the next slide? Can I just ask you to press that? Yeah. This is another sort of example of that. These are inhabitants who sort of work on saris. They sort of, sort of take out the edges. But the way they claim the building, the way this is, saris being dried, and the whole nature of the building changes in the way they occupy it. And this is the place, this image on the, bottom right-hand corner is where they've been moved to. But yet they continue to, this was a live-in workspace that they had, and they've now been relocated to this space out here, which is, this is the new India that's being portrayed. So for me, the interest is that, the question being raised is that we need to think a little more carefully. There's a certain independence that we have, or interdependence, that is there that we need to observe, more carefully. Next slide. Another example of, the motorcycle, which actually goes into the living room. It holds the pride of place in the living room of the house, but the way it overlaps or the way it overlays on top of the old architecture, so to speak, and the way they sort of come together, and it sort of loses the sense of time or loses its origin in the way they come together or the way they meet. Similar on the right side, these are, tribals who they lived in the forest, now have been displaced out of the forest. They work on, on the construction site on building roads. But they still maintain, because bamboo is available, they can harvest it. It's, you don't have to go so deep into the forest. So they're able to make these boats that they use for fishing, in the monsoons, in the small streams. But their ability to continue, a sort of a culture, a lifestyle, which allows them a certain quality or dignity, even in this sort of very difficult time of displacement. And so what they use is basically the recycled cement, the empty cement bags that they get. They use that as a liner. And then the asphalt or the tarmac they use to basically waterproof. So just these subtle gestures that sort of open up the space and provide a sort of continuity. But what's interesting is this imminence, is this condition that creates this inventiveness. I think that's important, and it's important to observe. Next slide. Again, road, being built, and what I like about this particular slide is the entire internal sort of cross-section of the house, or the interiors of the house are now exposed and become the new facade, to the road. And again, highways are extremely important, purely from the sense of mobility, transport, lighting and infrastructure. So, land along the highway in India specifically is extremely valuable. That's actually the most expensive real estate in the length and breadth of the country. As highways are being built, they get occupied. Next slide. So here's sort of interesting slide about the idea of dissection in architecture and then resurrection, where you can see the slide on the left, which is sort of hand cut, and it's been very carefully cut because that's the space provided for the road widening, but they don't really erase the entire building, or the demolition doesn't take place in a way. There's a sort of sensitive, and it's not intentional, it's just that it's the most economical way to do that. And then you see the resurrection out here of how the same columns, this is a building just further down, and how it's been sort of extruded up to reposition itself in that small sliver of space that is left. So again, just the idea of, how conditions change, what the idea of in this very difficult space where things are beginning to close or sort of constrict, how do you open that space up? Next slide. So, how does this translate into the practice? And I very briefly touched upon this idea that we're basically, about 10 days ago, we were only 2 architects and the rest were artisans or craftsmen, but they actually participate as architects, and we have a process of dialogue. So these are instruments. This is our studio workshop, where we make full-scale mock-ups, models, material tests. And again, this is to basically open up a more transparent dialogue or more open communication, in which there are more participants, and more people can engage. Next. So again, just showing you the atmosphere of the studio, how things are made. We don't necessarily have a specific direction, but we have a sense or an intuition, and then it's giving faith to the sense. There are a lot of difficulties that one goes through. I was just talking earlier about this, there's a certain hardship. But I think it's important to have this condition because that's what you need to plow through in terms of the possibility or the faith of something opening up. So anyway, this next slide. Again, just methods of working, tools that we use, right there, that's a full-scale mock-up. And you'd ask me, would this be, why this way? And we ran a practice where we had 10 architects, working in the studio. And what I found very often was, while we were drawing what we were supposed to build, it was already built on site and much better than what we were drawing anyway. So we just said we just get rid of this part of the studio. And so there's a certain immediacy. It's fast. Something like that would take, a couple of days to produce. So when you just calculate in terms of economy now, it's much more economical to actually build it this way. And what's positive or constructive about it is that many more people participate. You can position yourself. You can get inside the space. It allows the clients. It allows the participants. That's the builders, the designers, who are the builders actually, to all enter into a sort of discussion or a dialogue. Next slide. Again, this is interesting. This is a project we were commissioned to do a small community center in Chile, and I was talking to one of the carpenters, and the carpenter's now very, very highly skilled. He's 25 years old, and was describing him, through this Google map, this idea of the terrain, the topology, the idea of the mountains. He comes back the next day with this image, which is a sketch on the left, which are basically the hills of Udaipur, and his translation of the idea of topography, or the idea of a mountainous terrain or undulating terrain, and this idea of exchange of place, that is it necessary to be so specific to its location, but what if we can evoke the qualities of that place? So for me, it's an extremely important sort of sketch in the possibility of how one can think and how one can sort of evolve a process of, the process of making something. So just the references, because he doesn't have access to Chile. He's never been there. Not that I have, but it's just the way that it can evoke a certain sense, a certain quality. Next slide. This is another interesting, this is a small sort of it's sort of not a religious space, but a place where people can gather, and it's about water, a tree, and fire. And so this little drawing here on the right, bottom right, is sort of, I very quickly made this drawing. And the rest of it was all through storytelling, to sort of connect it back to his village, the place that we work in, connection to his grandfather, his father, and, him as a child, and, sort of making all these sort of connections, which then, he comes back the next day and he sort of produces this wonderful sketch, and it went beyond my own imagination and sort of relinquishing my position. And I think for me the interest is what occurs in these conversations and the possibilities that unfold, that sort of far exceed your own sort of, or rather my own limited potential, or the same can be said of him, because it's sort of making a mark in a way that triggers a situation for a situation to unfold. So I really like these drawings, because I would never have imagined to sort of put these objects in this particular way. So it sort of opened up a whole possibility, and that's what we're trying to work to, is how do I give up my role as an architect or a designer, where it becomes more open-ended, and in a sense, the participation that can happen is more unexpected. Next slide. Again, they've learned how to draw. I carry a red pen, and everyone has the same red pen. It's that micro ink 0.02. And everyone's drawing with these pens now in the workshop. Right from the plumber to the electrician to the carpenter. And they make these amazing, beautiful drawings that we use as working drawings in the construction of the projects. Next slide. Again, processes, that this is all the idea of color, the idea of texture, and I'm sort of, it's very basic, in the sense of, just simple materials, that are required to make architecture, so to speak, and it's just our interest. But how these are triggered, through familiarity, through memory, through time, and how, different colors can come together. So anyway, this is just to show an atmosphere of the nature of the work that we participate in. Next slide. Again, there's a sort of very precise inventory, or sort of the recipes are maintained, careful documentation. So it's sort of, in a sense, microscopic, looking through a microscope to sort of examine the possibilities and the variations. And again, this whole idea of practice, and through this nature of practice, that there's an evolution and that you can actually respond at the appropriate time through that practice. Next slide. I like this slide. I call it sort of postures in architecture. And, if one thinks about the idea of postures and the loss of postures, that possibly is there a loss in the technology or the way things are made. While materials might exist, that the loss of a posture, because I can't sit like this anymore. They can sit like that for 5 hours, 8 hours through the day and actually move around the entire day making these things. And, we were trying to do it in Venice because we didn't have all of them there. And myself and Sam, who's, American, we tried to do that. In 10 minutes we had to give it up. And that's the point when I realized that sometimes it also could be in the postures that we take that there's a possible breakdown of way things are made. Next slide. So again, just this is a sort of very quickly I'm going to touch on this idea of exchange or this participation. The next slide. This is a condition. There was a hole in the ground. We found sweet water. It was a house that we were building for a multi-generation family. But what was critical was using this potential of what was available below the ground. And we engaged a sort of master consultant, a master well builder who was actually a consultant for the project, because that became the origin, so to speak, the belly button or the real foundation of the project, which would then sustain or allow the house or the project to exist, because we don't really get water to the space. Again, you have to remember that more than 50% of the population goes to the source of water. They go to a tank, they go to a well, they go to a stream or a river. So it's not just getting water, but what's built up in the process of this idea of ritual of going back and forth to the water, and the associations that are made in the construction of this movement that actually becomes critical in the formation of the work or the formation of the object. Next slide. So again, it's all based on gestures, all based on nuances. In India, it's very difficult. Yes and no is the same. It's a nod of the head, which is yes and no. And you kind of have to decipher very carefully of what's being said. Again, you can ask the same question, today, and you come back and ask the same question the third day, and then they'll say that, why didn't you ask me that earlier? And, it's just the manner in which it's said, that's important. So anyway, here, this is the whole community getting involved in the making of this well. And what's interesting, it's not for themselves, but for somebody else. And the empathy that's involved in the making of this well. Great. This is all I need. Thanks. Next slide. So that's what they're able to produce. Again, this idea of architecture transcending time, what is the relevance of what we do? And for me, the interest is its ability to sort of position ourselves beyond our lifetime. So to look at time as a space that exceeds our lifetime or our period in the time that we're here. So the potential for it of being past, present, and future. And that was what I was trying to refer to, that you can actually flip it the other way, that, did it exist, can it exist, or will it continue to exist? And it's also how we participate in that endeavor. Next slide. And what's interesting here on the slide on the right is that this was a space which is, really the belly button of the house. You can go to it. And it was a surprise for us. I think was this registration of the tide, of the moon, of the cycle of the moon, of the seasons. And the earlier slide was shot in the monsoons where it actually fills up and you can't really enter that physical space, from time to time. Because if it's full moon, heavy rain, it's a high tide, the entire well fills up. And then this is the registration of time. So in a sense also the idea of the senses, that the loss of the sight, which is very strong or very, holds a very important position in what we do as architects, and the loss of sight, through the idea of sound, through the idea of this reverberation that takes place inside this cavity. Next slide. And that's just the arrangement of the house. So it really sort of forms those little dots there. I don't know if the pointer is working, but anyway, the dots there, that's really the space that's set underneath this sort of big courtyard. And everything, in a sense, supports this central idea. Everything supports this one position that's taken, and it's about the care and the attention that goes into supporting the origin of the project. Next slide. Again, just different methods and modes of working. We always have to find different ways of communication, different ways of being able to negotiate a space. And this might seem a random array of coconut trees. It was a house for a writer in a coconut plantation. Very odd condition, because you don't normally build a house in a coconut plantation, primarily because of falling coconuts, the leaves, heavy winds. And anyway, so to sort of get to the point, this was an instrument that we developed, and it's a very successful way for us that we found that making these models, which are very, very precise, down to, point something of a millimeter, that they can actually go and measure it. So that the drawing doesn't become an instruction, but a tool that you can actually participate and you can exchange in its participation. So you actually have to go and measure it and then take that back and then go and build it. So these are the tools that we sort of developed as an exercise or as a way to communicate precisely and transparently. Next slide. Just again, models, and what I like about them, that they become projects unto themselves. They remain in the studio. And this was sort of maybe my own dream fantasy, that I always wanted to have a sort of a studio like Charles and Ray Eames, where you were just surrounded by objects. But again, the idea behind this idea of osmosis, how things can enter into your skin, which is again building up on this idea of exchange, that sometimes you don't realize that you pass through a particular street and it takes you 10 years before you notice something, and that something has always been there. But you've never seen it in the way that you've now seen it. So it's sort of an opening up. It's the gesture that opens up a new possibility, and it's in the way that you see it. Next slide. Again, methods of working. It's sort of drawings. They've developed the ability to draw like this, axonometrics, details. And what I like is that I know for a fact that I would not be able to design or collectively, it doesn't really belong to anyone. So you kind of lose the authorship of the project. So you have to relinquish that position, and the way the participation takes place. Next slide. This is what comes through that participation. I'm not going to go in great detail about the project itself, but just what is possible through this process of dialogue. Next. 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 This I like. This is a school that we're building. It's a primary school, and it's actually a live-in workspace, because the lady, she's moved from Mumbai into the area that we live in, and it's a school during the daytime for the local village, the kids, and actually even the parents, and some of them are involved in building the house. And it's sort of very thick, dense grove of mango trees. And it became very difficult to sort of measure these undulations of the mango trees. It was, we don't have scanners and, all of that. So the best way was to just sort of go to site, and we built a full-scale mock-up, or really the project itself. It's this agriculture net, very cheap, on a wood frame, and the entire project was set up, and everyone could actually walk in there, eat in there, move through the space. And next slide. And drawings and models were made actually the other way. So we made the project, but the project itself is a project unto itself. There was very careful consideration in the materials that were chosen to evoke a certain quality or evoke a certain texture of the place, or the potential of the place. And so even the medium in sort of making the choice of what material one uses for something like this, it was a crazy idea, but we did the whole project in 10 days. As opposed to sitting in the studio trying to figure things out, imagine, the tree, the branch, going this way. Last few minutes, yes. Next slide. Next slide. Very quickly, this is the last project, but again, this was in the Himalayas. It's about 9,000 feet up in the mountains. It takes 8 hours firstly to get up there. It's a traveler's lodge for people going trekking into the Himalayas, and that's a sort of a place where you can actually also stay. Next slide. So, but it's a walk. It's a 2-hour walk through this kind of terrain, through this mountainous road. And I think one important thing is that there's a great culture of building. If you go up north, east, west, south, there's a particularity to this place, which I believe we can actually tap into this potential or resource that is in actual abundance. But it's a question of how do you get inside the space. But anyway, just showing the nature of the project. Stones are harvested locally, so more than 50% of the project was actually built on site with the local people who are primarily farmers, but this is their off time or their free time where they're able to participate, and that's what they actually do during their free time, is sort of, engage in things that build up their community. Next slide. Those guys are in disagreement. These guys are trying to find out what we've done, and it was more, again, a strategy or an attitude towards how we'd approach the project. We go to site, make the drawings. Again, it was a process of 4 or 5 days. On the 5th day, we were basically cutting the ground to make the foundations. Next slide. What was important in this project was it was actually leased from the farmers for 10 years. And the whole condition was we would have to return the land back in the way that it was, without any concrete or cement, and that they would be able to continue what they do, and that is agriculture, sheep, goats, all of that would have to be there as part of the place. Next slide. And that's what it's sort of 4 structures that are, laid sort of arranged in the landscape. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And that's how we see giving it back. So which one came first? Is this something that we found? Was it there? Was it not there? So it's this ambiguity, I think, that is really of interest to us. And it's in this ambiguity that there is a potential for what I believe is an exchange. There's a space opened up for a possible dialogue or an exchange. Thank you.